It's time to accelerate. Hey friends, this is Andy. Welcome to episode 637 of Accelerate, the sales podcast of record. I'm honored to be joined again on my show by my guest, Andy Molinsky. Andy is the author of Reach, a new strategy to help you step outside your comfort zone, rise to the challenge, and build confidence. Andy's also a professor at Brandeis University and a contributor to the Harvard Business Review. Now, in this episode, we're going to be talking about, as the title of Andy's book suggests, comfort zones. Now, most of us have personal and professional growth objectives, whether it's career or in life, but to achieve these goals, we have to learn how to step outside of our comfort zones, which is hard. And which means that we oftentimes employ avoidance strategies to avoid the challenges that could open up these new vistas for you. So in this conversation, Andy shares his 3 primary strategies for effectively reinventing yourself by challenging yourself to step outside your comfort zone. I mean, if you're in sales, I certainly remember my early days in sales when I first got started. I definitely had to step outside my comfort zones to learn how to go out into the field, carrying a bag, knock on doors, and make cold calls. That was a big step outside my comfort zone. Wish I'd known some of the things that Andy talks about in his books at that time. So look forward to this conversation. If you'd like to see the show notes for this episode, go to andypaul.com/637. As always, we provide a breakdown of this and all conversations on Accelerate. Make sure you check that out. Before we jump into my conversation with Andy, let me say that I often hear from listeners that are looking for a new sales challenge, and I tell them one of the most important elements to career success is aligning yourself with the right company. One that develops its employees, values its customers, and has a portfolio of category-leading products that can compete with anyone in the market. So if you're a top sales producer and you're looking to challenge yourself in order to take your career to the next level, then visit CenturyLink.com/accelerate. That's CenturyLink.com/accelerate. With its recent acquisition of Level 3, the new CenturyLink has become a world leader in providing cloud, security, real-time communications, and managed services. And so, if you're a top sales producer, you want to step it up in your career, then check out CenturyLink at CenturyLink.com/accelerate and see if perhaps CenturyLink is the right step for you and your career. All right, let's jump right into it. Andy Molinsky, welcome to Accelerate.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And we were just talking before we came on the air that this has been a long time coming for a variety of reasons, but I'm glad you're finally here with us.
Yes, likewise.
So, standard question I ask all my guests to start off the show is, in your mind, what is the single biggest challenge facing sales people today, sales professionals today?
It's a good question, and I can't promise. I can't promise to say that I'm the expert and I have the finger on the pulse of what challenges salespeople face. I do have to say though,
I think that's why we value your answer.
Yes,
you have a perspective maybe others don't.
Right. So what I do have as a perspective is that I've written a book called Reach about stepping outside your comfort zone. I've done a lot of work teaching, training, writing about helping people step outside their comfort zone, and I've talked to a lot of people about sales. These might not be people who focus their entire days and lives on sales, but that sales and making a sale is a key component to what they do and what they want to try to achieve, what their goals are. And I do find that a lot of people, and you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised at how outside people's comfort zone it is often to do sales. And by that, I mean lots of things. I mean cold calling. I mean walking into a networking event, pitching and promoting themselves and their product and their company, making small talk in a sincere, authentic way with people that they don't know, closing a deal. All sorts of components of sort of the sales process, I think, are outside many people's comfort zones. Not everyone, but many people. And so that's why I think it's been on my radar as an important topic.
Well, interesting. I think if people were really honest, even people who have been in sales for a long time, they would say that I'd say everyone, certainly in my experience, I've talked to, there's some aspect of the process that they're still uncomfortable with, that there still is outside their comfort zone. Even with decades of experience. I mean, I can speak from experience too. I mean, there's still, my least favorite part of selling is making cold calls. I do it, and I've done it for years. When I started my career making dozens of cold calls every day out in the field. But it still requires me to step outside my comfort zone to do it.
I understand that. I actually, as you were talking, I just had this flash of a thought. It reminded me, I'm not in sales per se, although I have to say that I do have to do quite a bit of sales in various ways. I'm a professor, and I'm also a writer, and I'm also, now I do some consulting and training on the side, but my main core job is as a professor at a business school. But I remember a long time ago, when I first got out of college, and my first job actually was essentially sales and essentially cold calling. I was in Paris, France, working for a small company, and we were trying to interest larger, it was mostly chemical companies, in customer satisfaction surveys, which was all the rage back then. And so my job was just kind of prospect essentially. And God, I remember
in French.
Yeah, well, a combination. It depended on who the client was. So if it was in the Netherlands, it would be in English. If it was in France, it would be in French. Now, my French was good, but there were plenty of native speakers for that. So they brought me in mostly to talk to sort of more English-speaking people, although I did use some French as well. But
yeah, I want to hear your pitch in French.
That's been a long time.
Oh, come on, step outside your comfort zone here, and I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, let's see. Je m'appelle Andy Molinsky. Je voulais hablar. God, that's Spanish.
Spanish, right?
I lived in Spain as well. Sorry, it's all.
That's okay. You're off the hook. That's good try. I like that.
It's all a mix. But I'll tell you something interesting about doing sales in a foreign language. Now, I should date myself, and that's part of the reason that my French is so rusty and mixed with Spanish, is that this was over 20 years ago. And but what's interesting, which I do remember, is that when I was doing sales in French, and my French at that time was pretty fluent, not perfectly fluent, but pretty fluent, it was actually easier to do it in French. And I think it's because when I was speaking in a foreign language, it's as if I was sort of putting on a bit of a disguise.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't quite me.
That's what I was going to say. It was like wearing a mask.
Exactly, and it was a little bit easier to do, and the emotional resonance of having to put someone on the spot and ask them something, in English, which is my native language, I have this sort of like immediate, unconscious, visceral impact, negative impact of sort of putting someone on the spot or making the ask or whatever it was. But in French, it was different because it sort of felt like I was kind of slightly detached, tiny bit detached, and so it actually helped me in some ways. And I also think that my accent helped me too, because it sort of started a conversation, it was a way to kind of build a bridge. Oh, where are you from? And so on and so forth. It's sort of a natural connection.
Well, yeah. And it's sort of an interesting thing to think about when you talk about reaching outside your comfort zone, because that's the topic of your book, and we're going to dive into it, is that maybe one of the first steps to being successful about stepping outside your comfort zone is, we talk about authenticity, but is to be who you want to be. It was almost like assuming a certain disguise. I mean, I know people in sales that have a sales personality, and you get them outside sales, which comes across as very authentic, and you get them outside the sales environment, and they're slightly different.
True, and I mean, I think anyone, I don't think that's exclusive to sales. I imagine that, like, the way that you speak with your grandmother is different than the way you would speak with buddies at a bar after work, which is different from the way you'd speak on a date with someone who you just met, and so on and so forth, right? It's like we all have modes. We all have shades of ourselves, in different ways that we speak. I'm a parent, and the way I speak with my kids now, who are 11 and 13, is quite similar to the way I'd speak to you, but certainly not when they were 3 and 5. You know what I mean? So it, I think we all have these variants of ourselves, and they can all sort of live within the realm of authenticity. But I think we know when we're sort of putting on airs and really not being authentic. In other words, being a version of ourselves that's actually not in that repertoire.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive into the book a little bit. So in the book, early on, you say, or you write, that in an ideal world, no one would have to reach beyond their comfort zone to succeed at work. I found that sort of fascinating to think about. If that was the case, then what would be our definition of success?
It's a good question. What I kind of meant there was that, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to do this, right? I mean, and I think the point is that I'm trying to make is that, to grow and learn and develop, and especially kind of key points in your career, oftentimes you do take on tasks and responsibilities that are outside your comfort zone because you have goals that you want to achieve, you have things you want to do, so you want to become a manager, you want to start your own company, you want to reach that level, whatever it might be, or maybe there's some sort of more personal reason. There are people whose lives you want to impact in a positive way. And to do any of these things, it's possible that you might have to step outside your comfort zone. You might have to take on different tasks and responsibilities. You might have to do sales, as we talked about. You might have to speak in public. You might have to become more of a public speaker. Maybe you have to have more of a presence on the internet, on social media, and become a thought leader. And maybe that's uncomfortable for you or not, whatever it might be. There are a lot of different activities that are associated with these goals that we care about for whatever reason. And those are the moments and times and situations where you do face a choice in a way. And I don't know if people conceptualize it as a choice, but I see it as a choice because what people often do is they avoid and they sort of craft their lives to kind of avoid situations like this. So they don't take on that responsibility. Sure. They stay in that role, whatever it is. They don't try to expand their business in this and that way. But if you do want to, that's the rub, and that's where stepping outside your comfort zone, I think, comes in. And by the way, it's not just professionally; it's personally too. I talked about having kids, becoming a parent for the first time, getting married, even, or whatever. There are certain milestones in your personal life as well that involve oftentimes stepping outside your comfort zone.
Well, I was trying to use that phrase you had written to say, okay, well, where can you work where you can stay within your comfort zone? And I was thinking, okay, well, Supreme Court judges, they're appointed for life, and maybe Pope, but that's about the only two I came up with.
Well, I think some people, in their careers can sort of hit a level where they're kind of what's the metaphor? That they're sort of like, they're just kind of running on routine in a way, that they're doing their thing. Like you've been whatever it is forever and you know how to do it and you're not stretching outside necessarily. I mean, I can think a lot of professions. Like let's say you've taught fifth grade for 40 years. Let's say you've been a pediatrician for 40 years. Maybe you've been a professor, whatever it's been. I mean, of course, there are industries that where that's by definition is not going to happen, like a super, fast moving industry with lots and lots of competition where you're kind of scratching and clawing to try to stay ahead and so on and so forth. I mean, those in those worlds, of course, you have to step outside your comfort zone. It's just part of your life. But there are many other professions and jobs and roles where it's not as much a deal, I don't think.
Well, it gets me to one of my core questions is that, and this is not something that came up specifically from reading your book, but something that I've been thinking about a lot and reading about a lot lately do we have this do we place too much importance on excellence, I guess is because oftentimes if you gave the example, somebody who's been doing the same job, for 10, 15 years, and let's say they're very competent at it. Let's say they're good at it, right? I mean, right now, good is really equated with being mediocre in so many cases. Like, you read so many books, it's, everything's about excellence and not attacking your book, saying stepping out of comfort zone. But, we have this thing where we have sort of implicit assumption that everybody should step outside their comfort zones. And I was, been at some events recently where, everybody talks about the top performers and it's like, but people that, there are people that are good at what they do and they're not top performers, but they're good. And they're within a comfort zone because that's what helps them. They defined it and they've been able to expand that or develop it in such a way that they are competent and good at what they do. And it seems like good is bad these days.
Good is the new bad.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about. I'm in my office right now, and if I look on my bookshelves, I can see, good to great.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the first book I see like that. But there are plenty of them like that. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it has to do. It's a complicated question, I think, actually. And my view on it is that it's very important in life to know yourself. I think sometimes people are striving for the best and the best and the best and the best because they don't really know themselves, and they sort of are attaching their ambitions to these sort of exponentially challenging goals. And furthermore, people who are
partly because we're telling them that whatever they're doing isn't good enough.
Well, and they're listening though, right? That
well, sure, it takes two. It takes two to tango, but it
resonates, and I think that it's important to be able to have sort of a comprehensive view of what you care about, what you value. For some people, it might be that being good at what you do is just fine. Being proud of what you do, working for a middle-sized company but not the biggest, being a good performer but not the best, whatever it might be, whatever your standard is, but that you're happy. That you have happy relationships in your life. You enjoy the time that you get to spend that's outside of work or whatever it is, having more of a full balanced life. And I think a lot of people feel that way. Now, of course, economics gets into this as well. Some people simply need to work and work and work and scratch to survive. So have it sort of like the luxury of sort of indulging and enjoying in their life is not as much on the table for them. But I think I see what you mean. And I see that, by the way, also, not just in professions, but also like, let's say in high school, trying to get into colleges, that, there's a lot being written lately about how if kids aren't able to get into one of those top 10 colleges in the country, in the US, let's say, that they're a failure. And they feel like that in these highly competitive high schools. And what a shame that is, like that's a broken system and a broken set of aspirations.
Well, and in any enterprise, I think of any size, you're going to have a distribution of people, right? You're going to have a very small percentage of people you call superstars, let's say. You're going to have a very small percentage of people who are just abject failures, and then most people are in that middle group. Yeah. And most of those people are good at what they do. They may not be superstars, but they're good at what they do. And yet we seem to obsess. I was at a conference a couple weeks ago with a bunch of sales leaders and CEOs and so on, and they were all obsessing on this idea about how do we get everybody to act like the top performers. And it's like, well, you don't want everybody to act. First of all, they can't all act like the top performers. And you need people who are good at what they do. Yeah. And I said this obsession with excellence, I think, actually is starting to become counterproductive.
Well, I agree with you, and it's not just an obsession about excellence. The other obsession I see oftentimes is with being a leader. And like, imagine if everyone was a leader, so to speak, and maybe someone would come along and say, "Oh no, it's important for everyone to be a leader, in so and so way." But if everyone's a self-starter, if everyone's a go-getter, if everyone's a leader, if everyone's an alpha, what kind of world are we living in? I think there's some value in being a team player. There's value in being a follower. There's value in being a leader at points, but stepping back at other points. There's a value. You know what I mean? So I think that I do feel I see the excess that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think we're again starting to institutionalize this whole fear of missing out and the FOMO, and it drives a level of anxiety that really, from my mind, starts becoming counterproductive for people, especially in things like sales, where it's, it is just by definition, it's a pressure-filled role. But I know lots and lots of people in sales who are quite good at what they do, able to do it with the minimum of anxiety and pressure, but they're made to feel less than because they're not ambitious.
Yeah, well, the other part of it is that where do we derive our sense of self-worth? Is it from our perceptions of where we stand in the face of other people on some sort of spectrum, or is it from inside, our own experience of ourselves, that we feel that we're good, that we're good enough, that we're happy? That's an internal story, an internal experience. And I think when people are so fixated with the best and the top performers and so on and so on, those are very external standards. And if people are sort of viewing themselves and their self-worth through those standards, I think that's a mistake, really. I think it's a mistake on multiple levels. It's certainly a mistake in terms of happiness and well-being, right. But I imagine it's a mistake in other ways too.
Yeah. I certainly believe it is. So in your book, you talk about this idea of necessary evils. We were talking about navigating personal comfort zones and so on. And I want to explore that a little bit. If you could tell people what you were talking about there.
Sure. So it's interesting. So my book Reach is about stepping outside your comfort zone, and it's sort of a user-friendly, book for anyone. Necessary Evils actually was a topic that I worked on with a colleague of mine from Harvard Business School. We went to graduate school together, and we did research on the topic of necessary evils, which are basically tasks where at work you have to cause someone pain or discomfort for some greater good or purpose. So we were studying managers performing layoffs, firing people. We were studying police officers evicting families and individuals from their homes, doctors performing painful procedures on kids. These are pediatric physicians, and also delivering bad news to parents. It was funny because when I started writing Reach or started thinking about Reach, I almost had like a blind spot to the fact that I had been researching this very topic, which I just described, for years, publishing in academic journals and so on. But I, for some reason, didn't put two and two together. And then eventually I had the epiphany, like, duh, I've been like studying this myself. And so I then incorporated some of that work into the book.
So I guess my question when I was reading that, though, is you weren't saying, I don't think, but I just wanted to ask the question is, that people can ever develop a comfort zone around performing these necessary evils?
Well, I think.
Just speaking to me personally, I've had to lay off and fire lots of people. I don't think I'd ever I develop a comfort zone around it.
Well, I guess it's tricky. It depends on how you conceptualize a comfort zone. So if a comfort zone, I guess, is a continuum instead of a dichotomy, like a dichotomy would mean that you're comfortable or you're not comfortable, versus sort of a continuum, which is varying degrees of comfort. I imagine over time you can start to become. It doesn't mean that you're complacent, and it doesn't mean you're not caring. You can be compassionate and have a comfort zone around your capacity to do it. I spoke with plenty of managers, for instance, who said, you know what, this is obviously awful and it's no good for anyone, but I'd rather be the person delivering the bad news here because I know how to do it. I know how to do it in a way that dignifies someone.
Oh, well, good luck with that. I'm not sure I agree that you can ever sort of do it that dignifies someone but I mean, it's. I guess I was sort of thinking, shouldn't we always be uncomfortable with these types of tasks? These types of.
I think on some level, right? I think it's a complicated situation.
I mean, I think that's where the humanity comes through.
Well, it could. It depends what you mean by comfort. Yeah, if you want to be like, if uncomfortable equals having empathy, yes, I would agree with that. But you can still feel sort of. I don't know. I think it ends up being a semantic issue around what you mean by comfort. My view on those types of things is that, of course, if you're human and you're allowing your human self to enter the equation, which I think is important, you should feel uncomfortable, right? Because you should really feel what the consequences are. You should understand the importance of what you're doing and the sacrifice that's happening, and understand and really appreciate and make certain of the greater good in the situation. But I don't, and I think. But I think that you can be confident about, or increasingly confident about, your capacity to do it. You can have a developing sense of conviction about why it's important. So a doctor, for instance, a young doctor who might be performing a painful procedure on a child, and early in their career, they might not fully appreciate the legitimacy and necessity of what they're doing. But if they've been at this for many years, they know the results of these over time, and they've seen the results, and they've seen kids who have recovered from these and how the early pain is worth the later gain, so to speak. It's not that they become complacent and they don't have any sense of empathy, but the task itself might start to become a little bit more in their comfort zone. Sure. Not saying that they're not conscious of the difficulty, but that it's slightly more in their comfort zone. That's what I mean by it.
Okay. No, I agree. So in the time we have left, we have about 10 or so minutes left. I want to talk about the 5 challenges to stepping outside the comfort zone that you talk about, because I thought there's some interesting material in there, and then urge people to buy your book and go through the rest of it, because very worthwhile read. So the first one is the authenticity challenge. We're talking about trying to step outside our comfort zone. One of the reasons we don't do it is because we sort of say, hey, if to take the step, this isn't me, as you said, this isn't me at all.
Yeah, I interviewed people from all different professions. I mean, entrepreneurs, of course, small business owners, executives, managers, but all sorts of people: doctors, police officers, actors, students, priests, rabbis, a goat farmer, all sorts of people. And so across the board, this is what I found. Not, by the way, not you don't experience every one of these challenges every time, but this is the set.
Sure,
There's
sure.
authenticity. Like, this isn't me. I feel like an imposter. I feel like a poser. And remember, you're stepping outside your comfort zone. This is by definition something that you're not as used to. A second one was likability. That was an interesting one, and I find that a pervasive challenge for people, psychologically speaking. That they worry people won't like this version of me. If I do this task, they will hate me. If I ask more, if I act more assertively than I normally am, they're going to think I'm a total, jerk for I don't know if there's a PG audience.
Well, yeah, it sort of is, but we know what you mean.
Insert your other word,
right?
Tell competence.
Tell the story.
Oh, sorry,
So in that one, the likability challenge, because I think I think this is kind of relevant today in a much bigger sphere. Is you give the story of a woman named Annie working for this very difficult person named Rick, who she was sort of afraid to really sort of stand up to him for fear that other people wouldn't like her as a result at one level. And maybe you can tell more about the story.
No, you're right. It is very sort of topical today in 2017.
With everything that's going on in terms of the stories that are now surfacing about the women that have been subjected to this harassment and abuse for all these years. And quite frankly, on the political scene, I think it's what keeps people from commenting about sort of the things that are happening in Washington.
She so Annie Harris was still is works for an investment firm that tries to encourage high net worth individuals to invest their money at the firm and to go on these meetings. She was a fairly young employee at the time. She had to have a portfolio manager accompany her, and that was Rick Schmitz, this guy who was essentially harassing her in a way, and certainly demeaning her, embarrassing her, shaming her,
right?
Living nightmare. And she wanted, we could get into the details I talked about in the book, but she wanted to tell this guy off. I mean, she felt at some point she had to, but the problem for Annie is that Annie was and is, although she's changed. I know Annie. She was a very modest person. She's timid. She was not assertive. It was way outside her comfort zone to confront this guy. And for the longest time, she was just terrified of it. And and by the way, she did in the end. But one of the reasons was this likability, which I actually remember asking her multiple times, is this really true? And she said yes. She was afraid that he would hate her if she acted this way. Now, of course, he's obviously the hateable one in this scenario, but that's what she was feeling. She was feeling a sense of inauthenticity because she was afraid that this just is not me. Oh my God, I'm going to do this. She was worrying about likability, that Rick would hate her. She was also struggling with a third challenge people face, which is competence, which is the idea that she's not going to be good at this. She's going to look like a fool. She's going to look like an idiot. That's her fear. And by the way, that's going to be obvious to other people. So she'll not only feel incompetent, and you can imagine this in sales, you can imagine this in public speaking, lots of situations where you're afraid to do something because you think you'll look like a fool. And by the way, you're afraid other people will see you as a fool. So there's the public-private side to it. So it's a tough cocktail of sort of psychological roadblocks and challenges people can face that when considering stepping outside their comfort zone. I guess sometimes I think of it as there's door A, which is, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot. Door B, I think I'm going to avoid. And there are all sorts of ways people avoid, I talk about in the book. But the question is what's going to nudge you to door A or door B? And these challenges like feeling inauthentic, worrying about likability, struggling with your perceptions of competence and feelings of incompetence, those push you to door, whichever the door was where you don't do it. I forget which one that was.
We'll call it door B.
Right, that one.
A comes first. That should be the good one. Well, I mean, I have my own story in that regard. When I started public speaking, roughly about 10 years ago, a little less than that. I mean, when I'd come home from a speaking gig, and my wife would ask me, well, how did it go? I used to use as my benchmark of success is that, no one stood up and called me an idiot.
There you go.
Right? And that was sort of the imposter syndrome, right? Is that, no one called me an idiot, so it must have been a good outing.
It's a terrifying thing. I have to say, I mean, I know people in the audience will probably nod their heads. I mean, I've been at this now for 20 years. I feel very comfortable speaking on stage and so on. But as a professor, I get a lot of practice, right? In front of MBA students and executives and so on. But I mean, early on in my career, I was just terrified of doing it for multiple reasons. Being up there on stage, feeling vulnerable, not being very good at it or practiced at it, or how to manage a crowd or manage my time or do any of these things. And then on top of it, I felt like, what do I possibly have to say that could be worth these people's time? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you're like, yeah, it's a tough one. It's a real tough nut to crack, for sure. It's outside many people's comfort zones.
Well, I think the thing with comfort zones, it's not summarizing the entire book, I'm not trying to, but I mean, one thought that as I think about this topic, because there's been a fair amount of writing in it the last few years, is that there's a certain maturity required to be able to step outside your comfort zone, and part of that is, to me, is at least a recognition that a part of success is failure, and that you sort of have to acknowledge that the step to getting where you want, or the path to getting where you want to go, is going to be littered with back steps at some point.
There's no question. I think that's really important to sort of develop that sense of resilience, have an attitude where it's more of a learning attitude than a performing attitude, or at least a combination, so that when you do, slip up, eventually everyone does, maybe not even eventually, maybe often, that you see that quote unquote failure as data. In other words, okay, good, this is data for improving. I mean, in my life, I've struggled with that. I've seen data early, sort of the feedback early on is sort of like devastating, but I've grown to learn to see it as data, and I think it's a positive way of approaching things. But that took time, that took maturity, and I think. But if that is a real thing that a lot of people can work on, that mindset.
Yeah. Again, I like your way of expressing it, is that feedback, failure is data. Let's use the data. What do we use data for? Do we use data to make better decisions?
Yeah,
improvement. So absolutely. Well, good. Well, Andy, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank you for joining us and tell people how they can find out more about your book and connect with you.
Yeah, I'd love to connect with folks. I have a website, which is www.andymolinsky.com. My name's spelled ANDYMOLINSKY.com. And, I've got lots of articles. I write for Harvard Business Review and Inc.com and Psychology Today. And I've got lots of articles and videos and all sorts of quizzes and assessment tools on there, and links to my social and my books and everything. And so even my email. So please come visit.
All right. Excellent. Well, good. Andy, thank you again for joining us. And friends, thank you for spending this time with us today. Make sure you come back, join us again the next time for another great episode of Accelerate. Until then, if you get a chance, go to iTunes, please subscribe, leave a review. We want to know what we can do to make this an even better experience for you. So thanks again for joining us. Until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.